Yes, thank you, Enrico, and good morning or good afternoon, Tony. How on earth do I fairly introduce Tony Driscoll? Well, let's try this. Imagine the most fast talking, fast thinking, most entertaining strategy professor you can, and that's pretty much sums up Tony. And Tony, I hope that makes it's a fair representation. And then you add some Superman literature and a Superman T-shirt on top, and there we have it. But slightly more on the serious side. So I've followed Tony's work for many years, and I've had the pleasure of listening to him several times, including at the Drucker Forum. So that's the Global Peter Drucker Forum, which takes place in Vienna, Austria, every year. And I remember, Tony, this was like the last in-person before COVID came around. So this must have been what, November 2000 and geez, which year are we in? Well, let's say November 2.5 years ago, almost 3 years ago.
Yeah. Okay.
And we were both in Vienna, and we were in one of these amazing buildings that they have with red carpets everywhere and really good high quality coffee, by the way. And I remember kind of grabbing Tony by the t-shirt and saying, "Hey, I got something you should take a look at." And like most faculty, he wasn't very interested. But we stayed in touch, and we stayed in touch, and we continued to stay in touch. And then when we finally got some time to talk, I think Tony was one of the first pioneering faculty anywhere that really saw the teaching learning potential in the simulations. And Tony, you know this, but I've really appreciated the collaboration. I've really appreciated the opportunity to work with you. And I really appreciate seeing how your strategy students are growing, well, hopefully in the right direction by using the Transform Strategy Sim. Tony also has a new book out. So for those of you that are in the book business, you should pick up Tony's latest book. And finally, Tony, we are actually going to be hanging out. We're going to go drinking together in Seattle, drinking tea, of course. I mean, when we both travel to the US, well, I travel to the US for the Strategy at Work conference later this year. So everyone, it's my great pleasure to introduce to you live from North Carolina, Tony Driscoll.
Great, Chris. Thank you. Thank you so much. I just wanted to say today I'm going to talk a little bit about the book, which is, I think, a topic that is directly related to strategy. But just to give you, to follow on that, and I was listening to your 9 points on the way in, Christian, and willing to partner. And I think that really led to quite a change at Duke University. I teach in the Masters of Engineering Management program. So these are highly technical undergraduates, not just in engineering, but biosciences and so on and so forth. And they're coming to kind of get a 1.5 years of business language. And when I took over the strategy course, my predecessor had worked with me at IBM, so it was very practical and kind of went through, 80 or so strategy tools, but it was more like a compendium. There wasn't a synthetic, there wasn't a context where you knew, just like you were saying earlier, even in the last presentation, what tool to use in what context given the situation. And so I tried to build in live cases, real things going on. For instance, we would definitely be doing Netflix right now if class was in session, just what happened with the model, so on and so forth. But the real moment happened when, Chris, you kindly offered the session for the students to learn. And at that point in time, just to set context, I had 25 students in one elective. Okay. And since that time, so prior to you coming, I had 25 students in one elective. The next year, I had 25 students in one elective. After doing Transform, the subsequent year, as voices carry with the students, there was a wait list so big that we ended up having 3 courses, and we increased the number of students to 35. And now this year, we're fully subscribed. So even though it's an elective, almost every student now is voting with their feet to come to the course. And I think that's directly attributable to the fantastic work you've done to kind of build a context within which the kids can learn how and when to apply what tools to create value. And I think that it really is, if you want to talk about a capstone from an academic perspective, you've nailed it. So anyway, that's where we're at. Enrico, would it be possible for me to share, or do you have to maintain power?
Oh, no, you can share. I'm just gonna make you co-host, and now you should have the rights.
So I can take over the whole meeting now. Is that right? Okay. Can everybody
Perfect.
see?
Yes.
So Chris has given you fair warning. I've got about 15 minutes to go through 30 charts, and that's just kind of how I roll. I tell things in kind of a story-based format. So let me tell you how it's going to go. The first thing I'm going to talk about is what's the problem. The second thing I'm going to talk about is what's the solution, and the third thing I'm going to talk about is what's the story. So this is a little bit of a story about work. I was approached by Brightline, which is kind of the think tank side of Project Management Institute, and they said, hey, we have a problem. So I'll explain what that problem is. Then I went on a 18-month kind of research agenda to try to figure out how to solve that problem. So I'm going to share with you what the solution is, and then at the end I'm going to share, how did that solution end up showing up in this, which is a comic book. So as somebody who typically writes very boring reports and analysis with references for every sentence that you put in, I went through a pretty large transformation myself, and worked with a graphic novelist friend of mine to kind of put this into a story. And the hope is that if this is about people and transformation, people relate to stories. So let's make that happen. So my goal in the next X amount of seconds is to get through this. So let's start with what's the problem. What is the problem? That's HMS strategies, the Titanic heading towards an iceberg, as you'll see later. One of the problems, if you know Antonio Nieto Rodriguez and his work on Product Revolution, is in project management world, they tend to talk about running the business and changing the business. Running the business is operations. Once we've figured out how we had create value above and beyond a certain cost structure, and then we optimize that using technology, that becomes operations. And then that just becomes the going concern. But if we have to change something, we have to kick up the project because it doesn't fit in with that structure. And typically the margin was there's a little bit of change the business going on, and there's a whole bunch of run the business going on. With the complexity in the world that we're dealing with today, there's far more projects coming online because we have to change the business in perpetuity. It's almost like change is the only constant. And then it throws off all of these trade-offs that need to get navigated in real time. So strategy is becoming far more dynamic. So that's one challenge, is that we're seeing more and more project-based work because the business needs to change at a far faster clip than it has in the past. Some more data on this from PMI. Over the next 14 years, we're going to see a 68% increase in project-oriented work. Executives classify that 50% of their organization's projects are strategic initiatives, because now you have bet the farm initiatives that are projects, right? And unfortunately, 28% of them are failing outright. And those projects are becoming increasingly complex. That in fact, today, highly complex projects represent 41% of the projects. So if you put those things together, project-based activities on the way up, strategic projects are on the way up, and the complexity of those projects is on the way up. Now, what does that mean? It means that 6 to 7 out of 10 of them are not realizing the expressed strategy, and 28% of them are failing outright. This is not going to get better. It's only going to get worse, because as you have more project activity that is increasingly strategic, that is bet the farm, and it's more complex, the current ways of working are not conducive to this kind of environment. And so that was the problem, right? The problem is we can't execute strategy well. Now, execute's an interesting word. In the English language, it means to do or to kill. So I do think that strategy is getting executed, but it's the wrong kind of executed. It's getting killed far more often than it is getting implemented. So now the language is kind of more from execution to implementation. And when we look at the strategy implementation challenge, again, going back to PMI's, Brightline's research, 88% of CEOs say it's about implementation. The problem is not strategy formulation as much as it is getting it done. 59% admit that they struggle to bridge the strategy design and delivery gap. And a lot of that is because, I worked in strategy for many years as a consultant. You get brought in as a consultant, you sit in the mahogany office with your senior executives, you come up with a clearly articulate strategy for an ecosystem or a platform or whatever you want to call it. And then you roll it out to the masses who have no comprehension of what's going on or how it works. And certainly if it is a strategy that's going to kind of reimagine the company, it's going to be anathema to how you're currently structured, because there's this thing called structural lag. The way that we're organized structurally and procedurally and technically is always out of phase with the reality of the marketplace. Maximize efficiency in the prior business model where we created competitive advantage. So we're always structurally out of phase. So those who are stuck in that structure see what's coming down the pike as a big change, and it's really difficult to deal with. So in order to get there, what do you need? Leadership skills is critical. That comes from the Navigating Complexity report that PMI did. And cultural attitudes are the #1 barrier. So at the end of the day, this comes down to, if you truly want to implement a novel strategy that's going to create competitive advantage, all right? I'm not going to say sustainable over time, because that's another challenge, as we know from Rita's work, is that, you know, we have transient competitive advantage, not sustainable competitive advantage. Then we need to bob and weave. We need to be able to move with the context that we're operating in. And the two key drivers to make that happen are the right kind of leadership to be able to navigate complex projects, and the right kind of cultural environment to allow that to happen. Now, what's the cost of this stuff? So PMI did a big one, the cost of poor implementation, right? And essentially, it's about 2 trillion a year. So that's the GDP of Brazil, or it's $1 million every 20 seconds. So by the time I'm done with this presentation, we're talking about, you know, whatever, 20 million bucks has just been spent on people trying to implement a strategy that they do believe will create competitive advantage, but they're not successful. So the question is that kind of I went and embarked on is, why do organizations fail to make the changes required to implement their strategy 7% of the time? It's not necessarily the strategy is not well formulated. It's that it can't actually, it gets executed in the wrong sense of the word, meaning it gets killed. So the problem lies within the organization and its inability to adapt. So that's where the work went. So I went on kind of a mission to try to understand this, and I started to try to look into a couple of places where we had successful kind of transformation. And one area was Agile, right? So when Agile software development came out, I went into the history of all that. This is one of the original documents from the Agile Manifesto. And one of the things I found very interesting is that they had 4 core tenets, 4 core values that they adopted, and everything flowed from those values. That we value individuals and interactions over processes and tools. We value working software over comprehensive document. We value customer collaboration over contract negotiation. We value responding to change over following a plan. The stuff on the right doesn't mean that it doesn't matter, but if we want to really truly drive agile software development, we must value the left more than the right. We must move away from the right. It still has to be there. And we need to think about individuals' interactions, working software, customer collaboration. So I thought that framing was very useful because it's simple, it's grounded, and it's saying what we need to value. And if we don't value these things, we're not going to get the change we want. The second was a piece of work that was done by Brightline prior to me coming in, where they essentially said people form the link between strategy and design delivery. They're the ones that turn ideas into reality. And I you know, in a prior life, I worked at IBM in knowledge management with Larry Prusak and Rob Cross, and they wrote a fantastic article in HBR that say, you know, people make organizations stop or go. So people can either, through their discretionary effort and their belief in a particular aspiration, they can make an organization go because they're contributing all their efforts to it. Or similarly, if they don't see the value of the change, they can make the organization stop. So it was those two things that led me to a key insight. If you can't get the people to change, the organization, the strategy won't be realized. And then what I realized is when we start to think about change, organization change works only when belief precedes behavior. People must believe before they're willing to behave differently. Martin Luther King did not say, I have a plan. That he had a dream. And by articulating that dream, he was able to kind of tap into the aspirations of other people that ultimately led to the civil rights movement and even a change in the law of the land. But belief must come before behavior. So you have to get belief and behavior before structure, process, and governance, not the other way around. And so what I believe is happening in terms of strategy getting executed in the kill sense of the word is that we've put the tangible cart in front of the emotional horse. What do I mean by that? When we want to implement strategy, when we want to get that strategy done, we tend to focus on the tangible levers, the things we can see and measure of structure, of systems, of processes. And then we say, okay, we're implementing whatever, software tool X or process Y, so on and so forth. And what we ignore in doing that, because they're tangible and they're measurable, is the emotional levers of experience, belief, and behavior. And because we put the cart in front of the horse, That's where the resistance comes from to change. Peter Senge famously said, people don't resist change, they resist being changed. So in order for a strategy to get successfully executed in an organization, people need to be involved in that process. And one of the things I really enjoy about Transform is, I think, Chris, we've proven at Duke that even master's students, now clearly they're not going to perform as well as a board or as executives, but I think we've proven over the last 3 years in collaborating that this experience is one that gives you a very good sensibility around strategy. And if you have people throughout your organization that have that good sensibility around strategy, they will be more willing to adopt it because they feel more engaged with it. On one level, in terms of understanding what it is, and in another, even better, if you want to morph your organization onto where, you know, strategy is everyone's business at every point in time, because you have to make decisions around a shared aspiration. So that's kind of the key insight that came from the research. And then this is the goofy, crazy model that came out of it. So to create a culture of shared aspiration where the organization and everybody in it has common meaning and desire to get to an outcome, I have a dream, to ensure that people are aligned around that aspiration, to give people the autonomy to take action and have agency where they know they can contribute based on their perspective, but also at the same time holding them accountable for delivering, because we have to move the whole organization forward. So the goal here is, how do you create a leadership system that drives, that nudges the culture towards aspirational alignment, autonomy, and accountability, which if you get those four, you get agility. Agility ships with the freight. You have to, in leadership system needs to encompass these 10 components. Now, there's a whole book on this thing, but I'll give you a very high level view of what each one of these is and what the key shifts you need to make are. So again, I borrowed very heavily from the Agile Manifesto. So let me give you an example, right? Communicating a compelling change narrative. This is the test. So I give this as a test to, I don't care what level of organization I ask people to take what I call the PCT pulse. Think about this for your organization. Do your leaders communicate a clear, concise, consistent, and compelling narrative that makes a purposeful, passionate, and emotionally resonant case for change? If your leaders aren't doing that at every level, then people don't have the plot. They don't get it, right? So in order for that to happen, the shifts that have to happen within leadership is we have to value the shared aspiration over the required action. If all leaders are ever doing is saying, have you done the shit that I asked you to do yesterday? Where's the growth? I'm not saying that it's not important. Just as with Agile, you've got to deliver on results. However, if you're going to have a leadership system that's going to look to the future and have that long-term vision that Chris was talking about, people need to have a shared aspiration. You need to be looking over the next ridge and see where you're going. Emphasizing the possible future over the problematic present. If all we're going to do is worry about the problematic present, we're going to go in a sinkhole. There's plenty of problems that we have to deal with, but we also need to see the possibility for the future. And then with a nod to Simon Sinek and all the work that Raj Gulati is doing at the moment, is the purposeful why over the actual what and how. Whose job is it to articulate the why and find meaning? So essentially, each one of these has a PCT Pulse question about leadership. And then if you don't do well in each one of these areas, these would be the shifts that you might have to make individually as a team and as an organization in order to create the conditions so that you have aspiration, alignment, autonomy, and accountability. Does this make sense? We okay? Thumbs up from Enrico. So second, our leaders generate respect and followership from others by personally, authentically, and openly modeling the change, beliefs, and behaviors required to evolve the organization. Yesterday, I went into my kid's room and it was a nightmare. He's just back from college. I'm like, kid, clean up your room. I went in there last night. In the chat, was the room cleaned up? I'm seeing no's all the way down the line. If you have kids, you know. And why? Well, I went into my room and guess what? My room looked like a shitstorm. So why on earth would my kid clean up his room if me, in a leadership context, doesn't model that behavior? So if the leaders aren't walking the talk, if they're not demonstrating the change behavior as opposed to just demanding it, if they're not being authentic and open about the fact, I don't know the answer, but some of us can figure it out, if they're not really creating a culture saying, let's try and learn over think and plan, I'm not saying thinking and planning should be thrown out the window, but I'm saying we need to extend by trying and learning. Maybe we need to, launch a whole bunch of these tools inside the organization, create a little bit of internal venture capital, and allow people to test. We did that at IBM, right? Creating the conditions to allow people to find their way forward in a world that's more complex. Our leaders show vulnerability, seek help, demonstrate that failure is acceptable, and constantly seek to increase the autonomy and accountability of others. How many leaders do we have that show vulnerability over projecting power? No leader today knows what's going on. They can't. It's too complex. None of us is as smart as all of us. How many leaders ask open questions? I don't know, what do you think, over demanding definitive answers? I need to know the results by tomorrow. How many leaders make failure safe over playing it safe so that their retirement plan is okay? Our leaders bring clarity and focus by prioritizing and communicating the key strategic priorities that matter most to the business, right? So how many leaders focus strategic attention instead of measuring project progress? Half the projects in the system aren't going to yield value, and we let them float around inside the system despite the fact that they're dead on arrival. How many of us have disciplined prioritization over holding multiple options? I'm all about options theory, but not if it goes completely crazy. When Steve Jobs came back to Apple, right, he drew a 2x2. He got rid of the Apple Lisa, named after his daughter, and said, we need to have business, enterprise, PC, and laptop. That's it. We need to get back to 4 products. Scully had gone amok because he was an FMCG guy. He just thought the more products, the better. And how often do we prune project portfolios rather than letting them flow? Once a project gets into the system, it's like a cockroach. You can't kill it. It just keeps going through. And that's giving up the opportunity for a new one. And once a project is down inside the guts of a firm, it's not getting any signals from the market as to whether or not that project is useful or not. I worked with a gentleman who was the president of Coca-Cola, and then he went to Revlon, and he literally went into a store, a CVS store here in the United States, and he saw the display for a product that he knew was no longer being manufactured. And he's like, oh my God. And literally, back to your point, Chris, earlier, he did 100 phone calls a day through the telephone, this is pre-internet, to reconnect the factory to the store. The whole system had been broken down, right? Our leaders understand how to motivate discretionary effort by tapping into the aspirations of others and giving them autonomy in return for accountability. How many of us channel the aspiration of the people we're working with to allow them the opportunity to develop? How do we motivate with inspiration over manipulating with fear? How do we recognize novel effort, even if it failed, over requiring conformity? Again, the gray stuff is not saying we shouldn't do it. It's saying, but we need to stretch from that if we want to create an environment that's going to be dynamic, that's going to be, risk-taking, that's going to find the next breakthrough, that's going to take the organization on the next S-curve to move forward. Giving others agency. Our leaders create agency by take independent action and make changes without hierarchical approval. I know that happens in Chris's organization. I'm not sure it happens in my organization. I'm not sure it happened at IBM when I worked there. So leaders have to think about give and take reciprocity over top-down hierarchy, allowing independent action over requiring prior permission. Roger Martin says this better than anyone else. The 2 things that kill innovation, 2 words, prove it. Prove it is prior permission. Bring me the proof, and then I'll give you permission. Well, if you're going to do something breakthrough, how could you prove the iPad is going to be a killer product in the market? Because there is no market for the thing yet, right? So I'm not saying everything needs to be in the 5% bet the farm portfolio, but there should be 5% in the bet for the farm portfolio, and those should be the best possible opportunities. Giving individual agency over exercising authority. So letting people, find their way. And that's how you unlock what we call discretionary effort. Our leaders only help make the choices they're best equipped to make, clarify the choices others have to make, and the boundaries within which to make them. This is Roger Martin's book about choices. He thinks about organizations as choice factories. And it's the speed of choices that actually differentiates firms today. And I agree with that position. So sometimes you have to value experience and expertise over position and role. There's a lot of times where you have expertise inside the organization that is not recognized by a role that you should be listened to. Secondly, if you're a leader and you've defined a strategy, you need to explain the rationale for that strategy over expecting agreement. Just because you are in a position of power, if the people don't understand it or don't understand the rationale, they're not going to follow you. And also, you need to give up power. You need to distribute decision-making over centralizing decisions. The problem with, if you think about organizations as choice factories, is that Bottlenecks, as Peter Drucker famously said, tend to be at the top of the bottle. And if you do an organizational network analysis on the decision flow, it always gets stuck at the top. So we have to decentralize decision making if that's something that we're looking to do. If we're trying to get the organization to move more quickly. Catalyze the network. So we think about organizations not about as hierarchies, but networks. So we have to tap into the informal network of the organization more than we do the organization hierarchy. We have to think about organizational network analysis. Who's the right constellation of people to work on this particular thing? And most importantly, it's not about an assigned cross-functional team. We're going to develop a purpose for the organization. So we're going to have one person from HR, one person from ops, one person from marketing, and they will define it. That never works. Emergent collaborative teaming is where there are people who are passionate about being engaged in this. I'm doing a project with Red Hat right now. And the whole story of how they developed their purpose, they opened it up to the whole organization, 10,000 people. And 20% of those people were fully engaged in this process. And because they had 1 in 5, of people who voted with their feet because they were passionate, what emerged as their purpose statement was the purpose statement of the place. Nobody was against it. Our leaders catalyze collaborative leadership required to successfully navigate dynamic, complex, and systemic change. This is Peter Senge about systemic leadership. You need systemic collective leadership over functional hierarchy. We tend to think of leadership as role and position. It's a noun, not a verb. Leadership is a set of actions and interactions and between people at every level. And there's only one definition in my mind for leadership, and that's that you have a follower. Leadership's job is to engender followership. How do you engender followership? How would you get a person to go over the cliff with you, right? And if you can do that, then you can catalyze and guide change over control and monitor compliance. And then you've built an adaptive leadership system that can bob and weave, that has the sense organs at the edge of the organization to identify whether something's changing over just simple technical leadership practices. And if you can do all of that, and you can keep working that adaptive system, you can consciously and continuously nudge the culture in the direction of aspiration, alignment, autonomy, and accountability. But to do that, you really need to put the cart back in front of the horse. You need, or the horse back in front of the cart. You need to think about the human and emotional change and how people are going to feel about it over the technical and rational change. You can't take culture on directly. You have to activate each of these elements as you move forward in the way that makes sense for you. And you have to, the leadership system needs to work on nudging the culture over leaving culture to chance. So let me just see, where am I on time here? I am 4 minutes over. So let me pause there and see if there's any questions or concerns, or if I've derailed the whole set. Enrico, let me pass it back to you.
Tony, I don't think there are concerns or even deaths among the audience, but there are a couple of questions. And I think the first question here comes from Pex in Colombia. So the question here, Tony, is, have you seen an organization where they first define a very solid strategy and then they actually go about changing most of the management team to have a more implementation capable management team, but retaining the old strategy, if you will? Have you ever seen those?
Not necessarily, but what I do see is, I think language is a problem, right? So I think in the old world, we used to talk about strategy formulation and execution, Chris, right? And I always say the big problem is strategy formulation is kind of happens in headquarters where people think, and then it's thrown over the transom to the hired hands where people are supposed to do, but the hired hands weren't part of the creation of it, so they don't know what to do with it, right? So I think there's always been this gap, and I think that when organizations find a source of differentiated competitive advantage, and then they kind of to optimize their cost structure around it so they can open the jaws of profitability and attract more shareholder value and all that good stuff. What they're doing is they're building in core rigidities around their old business model. Because you're putting in structure, you're putting in process, you're putting in measures, you're putting in routines, you're putting in cadence calls, sales, go to market, all that kind of stuff. And by definition, you're doing that to increase the efficiency around a source of a competitive advantage you have uncovered before your competitors in this current time frame. The problem is that we're no longer on solid ground. You talk about the strategic landscape, and we tend to think about that as mountains in Norway. Well, now it's more like we're out to sea in the middle of a storm, right? And so you could be at the top of a mountain and you could have a position of advantage, as we learned from military. But when you're in stormy seas, at one point you've got a great vantage point and you think you're at the top of the hill, but all of a sudden you're down in a deep, dark dungeon because the nature of the environment has changed. So if that's the world that we're operating in a world where the landscape can shift, then you need a far more agile leadership system. So in the old world, I think it was kind of think and do in big 5-year chunks. Now I think it's think and do at every moment and every interaction with the whole organization. It's almost like the organization's moved from machine to organism. It's like an amoeba. It senses at the edge, oh, there could be light over here, which means there could be food. So let's kind of move in that particular direction. So I think the bolder the strategy, the harder it is to implement, because the further away it is from what we've actually instantiated in the last round in order to make it happen. You see what I'm saying? But so I actually believe that a purpose statement, as you know, Simon popularized it would start with why, but you know, if you look at Galati's latest work, he's really dug into purpose. I think a purpose statement gives you a true north for a longer period of time, and strategies serve that purpose, but different strategies would serve that purpose over time. But people need to understand the purpose, because that's what allows you to make decisions in a complex environment. That shared purpose. Did that answer your question?
Yeah, no, you did. I'm going to do one more question. Then Enrico, you can manage time, because Tony and I we could go at this for a while. But I want to take a question from Mark. Could you give us an example? I mean, Tony, I know you've done tons of work both in industry and academia. Could you give us an example, kind of applying some of these elements in practice? Like, we just one or two quick examples.
Yeah. So let me. So what I do is the first thing I do is I ask. I don't care what level I'm at. Right now, I'm working at senior director, VP level inside a large telecom company. I'm working at the executive board level with a medical device company. This is what I give them. I say, answer these questions. And so they score it. I call it the PCT pulse, right? And then after they score it, then we can have a conversation about, when you were thinking about leadership, were you thinking about yourself? Were you thinking about you and your team? Or are you thinking about the organization? Because this works at every level, if you know what I mean. And that's the idea of it. It should be a fractal. And then what we do is we map it. Let me see if I can show you what I mean. Sorry, these are like the super cool graphics inside the book that you will see. But the basic idea in the book is that we have to move from a top-down hierarchical leadership system, which in the book is instantiated as something called the MERB, the MUC, Immutable Rule Book. Demand fail-proof plans, measure outcomes, impose hierarchy, dictate direction, da, da, da. So in the story, May, who's this main character here, she and Pratik, maybe she'll become a leader, practical engineer guy, they start to try to play the rule book. And the rule book doesn't yield the results that they're trying to. So then future May comes back and it says, no, you need to move from the MERB to this much more engaged system. Now, so what we then do is we say the MERB is the status quo. This is how most organizations run. That's how we want a fail-proof plan. We want a Gantt chart. We want a budget. We want a timeline. We'll kick your butt if you don't get things done on the timeline. I'm not saying that has to go away. I'm saying that is the actual core of every business. And it's an important core. However, if you want the organization to survive over time, over the long run, all those things you talked about, Chris, you need to get a sense of these particular people-centered transformation elements. How well are we doing on them? So when they'll do the map, it's like, oh, well, you guys are very MERBY on decentralized decision-making. So as a leadership team at whatever level you're at, what are you going to do more, better, differently to value experience and expertise over position role, explaining rationale over expecting agreement, distributing decision-making, and then we have a conversation. Literally, there's a thing, what will we do more, better, differently? Because it's through our actions tomorrow, by making these small shifts, that we'll be able to move that red line out through our demonstrated change behavior. And it does, whatever, different organizations will have a different area that they need to work on. That's why it's not a linear thing. It's more of a network thing, because what you're really trying to do is catalyze a network. Does that help, Chris?
That helps a lot. And Tony, if people want to learn more about this, where do they go to find your book? I know it's a leading question.
complexsimple.com is my website, and you know, the book, I've written 3 books, but you can get that up there.
All right, we're gonna pick that up and put it in the chat. But for everyone, if you get a chance to travel to Seattle in October, you're going to be meeting not only me and Tony, but a bunch of pretty nice people, I'd say, that do a lot of work around people, strategy, and transformation. So that's the Strategy at Work conference. And Tony, I want to end up with this question: are we going to get the pleasure of hosting you in Vienna again this year?
Yes, yeah, I will be in Vienna, so we'll be able to catch up on the conversation we had. What, it was 2.5 years ago, or how long ago, Chris? My mind doesn't work when we've been in the fog of COVID. So
I suspect it works pretty well. So for all of you guys, there will be a fantastic conference in Vienna in November. It's the annual, I believe this is the 14th Global Peter Drucker Forum. And I can really recommend it. It is my by far #1 management conference of the year.
Me too. Me too.
We really get a chance to meet and engage with some amazing people in Vienna. And then small preview, we may be hosting a small event, details pending. So just mark middle of November in Vienna, and you'll have some Viennese coffee and pastries with Tony and myself. I'm buying. Tony, it is really genuinely always a pleasure. And I have one last question. So in my calendar, it says Duke Transform a weekend in November. How many students are we going to be running through Transform this year with you?
Well, like I said, so now there's 2 in the fall. And so again, we only had 1 class with 25 students. Now we'll have 2 classes with 35, so 70. There'll be 70 in the fall, and there'll be 70 in the spring, because we have 2 classes in the spring. So we've gone from, like I said, 1 class to 4 classes. But if you want to do the math, we have 5 times the students who now want to engage in this nuanced strategy discussion. And honestly, as you well know, I said to my students, would you rather me go back and do 3 lectures instead of taking the time and transform? and if there's one thing where I get 100% on, 100% of them say, hell no. Right. So
I think you frame it, somewhat leadingly, but the point taken, Tony, and on behalf of myself and the entire Strategy Tools community, really, we will really look forward to working with you all again in November.
Great. I look forward to it. And like I said, if we want to test other things out, I've got my team who worked last year, and they're willing to learn and do whatever you need, Chris. So
yeah.